Greetings, Honorable Speaker, Dr. Imma Ramos, Honorable Moderator, Dasha Zangmi-Dukpa, and online guests. Welcome to the Shichankar Virtual Seminar Initiative on Buddhism in Conversation on Contemporary Challenges. The series is organized by the Center for Bhutan and GNU Studies. We are delighted to create a platform to expose the viewers to serious research and studies of Buddhism so they see its benefits and be interested, and also to share resources for those wanting to go further. In this series, eminent speakers from the world will share cutting-edge insights on how Buddhist practices are being re-understood and used to improve people's performance in professional settings as well as their spiritual path. So listeners ponder how this might advance GNH across Bhutan. For today's session, I'm delighted to welcome our esteemed moderator, Dasho Zangli-Dukpa. Dasho Zangli began his career as a teacher in 1970 and had worked both as teacher and head teacher in all graded schools in Bhutan. He was the first national principal of the Hiraphone College, the then only university college affiliated to the University of Delhi, India. He had the privilege to work as Deputy Director of Education, Zonda of Chuka, and the first Vice Chancellor of the Royal University of Bhutan. On joining politics, Dasho became the first democratically elected Minister of Health in 2008 and subsequently worked as a Member of Parliament. He retired from active public service in 2018 after serving Tsawasum sincerely, loyally, and patriotically for over 48 years. Dasho has published a number of articles and books, several books on higher education systems, teaching professions, decentralization and people's participation, the roles of members of the parliament, and monastic education in Bhutan. Dasho Zangli was conferred Red Scar by His Majesty the Fourth King of Bhutan in 1994. Thus, it is a great pleasure for the CBS team and our esteemed audience to welcome Dasho Zangli. The screen is yours.
Guru Sangpo, good afternoon. And let me join my colleague Dim to welcome all of you to this very important seminar. And, drawing inspiration from the royal kasho or royal decree on civil service reforms, educational reforms, and also building upon the past conferences the Center for Bhutan and GNH Studies has conducted in the past. So I'm really privileged to moderate this important seminar, and I'm very happy that we have venerable Buddhist scholars, dashos, and other eminent people from both within and outside the country. Now, the seminar series that is organized by Center for Bhutan and GNH Studies really attempts to engage the eminent scholars, speakers, accomplished academicians, researchers, and with the aim to share their research works and findings with a larger audience. Now, this time, we have the speaker who is going to enlighten us on the Vajrayana Buddhism or Tantric Buddhism. And as we all know, Bhutan is the only country that is known for Tantric Mahayana Buddhism. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm profoundly privileged to welcome Dr. Imma Ramos from the British Museum. Dr. Ramos is a renowned curator working in a renowned museum, the biggest museum, the British Museum. And Dr. Ramos has specialized in the curatorial works from the medieval to modern South Asia collections. And she has recently curated the exhibition on Tantric Enlightenment to Revolution from 24 September 2020 to 24 January 2021. And she's also the author of this book, accompanying book, which presents the first historical exploration of Tantric visual culture from its origin in India to its reimagining in the West. So her research interests revolve around the relationship between religion, politics, and gender in South Asian visual culture. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am really delighted to introduce Dr. Ramos today, and we look forward to Dr. Ramos, your insightful and intellectually stimulating presentation. So, Dr. Ramos, the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a real privilege and honor to be here with you today. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. And today I am excited to have been invited to speak about the exhibition that I recently curated at the British Museum. It essentially aimed to demystify Tantra and particularly it aimed to challenge the stereotype that it's a stereotype that really exists in the West still, that it's this hedonistic guide to sex. And in the presentation today, I'll be not only talking about the Tantric Buddhist material that was on display, but also the Hindu Tantric material. And of course, there's so much fluidity between Hinduism and Buddhism. So I'll be talking about rich variety of material that was on display for the exhibition and the relationship between those different types of materials. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, it looks like it just needs a little bit of a warm up. Here it comes, hopefully. Bear with me. It's the, what do you call it? The sort of circle of doom when it, when it takes a while to load. But hopefully it should come up very soon. Okay, maybe I should try stop sharing and then start sharing again because it was much quicker before. Sorry everyone about that. I'm not sure why it's struggling. Let me try again. Ah, here we go. Okay, great. So, the first major exhibition of Tantric material culture in the West was held in 1971 at the Hayward Gallery in London. It was advertised as an exhibition exploring the Indian cult of ecstasy, as you can see on this poster that advertised the exhibition. This reflected a particular reading of Tantra as a so-called cult that could overcome stifled attitudes to sexuality. This was very much a product of Tantra's reception in the West during the 1970s, but the idea still persists today. So, what exactly is Tantra? In the exhibition, we presented Tantra as an Indian philosophy which affirms all aspects of the material world as sacred and infused with divine feminine power. It teaches that enlightenment can be achieved rapidly by actively engaging with spiritual obstacles such as desire, aversion, and fear in order to ultimately transcend them. Tantric imagery is therefore unique in its inclusion of erotic and macabre symbolism. The central aim of the show and the accompanying book was to present the first exploration of Tantric visual culture, from its beginnings in India to how it was reimagined in the West through visual culture. Tantra is rooted in sacred instructional texts composed from around the 6th century onwards called the Tantras. These are often written in the form of a conversation between a god and goddess. We open the exhibition with some of the earliest surviving Tantras in the world, on loan from Cambridge University Library. The exhibition was then divided into 4 major sections which explored Tantra's links to successive waves of revolutionary thought, from its early medieval transformation of Hinduism and Buddhism, to the Indian fight for independence, and the rise of 1960s counterculture in the West. The show presented an examination of Tantra through a series of visual case studies, some of which I'm about to talk to you about, almost all from the British Museum's collection, to illustrate a history of Tantra beyond the texts, which usually receive the most attention from scholars of the philosophy. The Tantras can be enormously enriched by an understanding of the material objects to which they gave rise. The range of objects in the exhibition included representations of tantric deities and tantric practitioners, objects used in tantric practice, and objects that reflect reimaginings as well as misunderstandings of Tantra. Above all, the aim was to provide visitors with the tools for recognizing certain signs and signifiers, from skull cups and weapons to sexual acts, as specifically relating to the Tantric imaginary, in order to understand how its philosophy has been visualized throughout history. Each of these signs carries a range of different associations and meanings, depending on the object's original intended audience, from rulers and lay devotees to monks and yogis, as well as its context, whether public or private. The first major section of the exhibition explored the rise of Tantra in medieval India, followed by an examination of the role of Tantric yoga at the court in early modern India. The development of Tantra in India coincided with the rise of many new kingdoms across the subcontinent after the decline of the Gupta Empire. Although this led to political precariousness, there was also a great flourishing of the arts. Many rulers were drawn to Tantra's promise of power, and public temples often incorporated tantric deities as guardians. This included the tantric god Bhairav, seen here. He is a tantric manifestation of the Hindu god Shiva, who delights in defying social and religious boundaries. According to myth, Bhairav beheaded the orthodox god Brahma, who had insulted Shiva. Bhairav wandered across cremation grounds as penance, using Brahma's skull as an alms bowl. The story reveals the tensions between orthodox and tantric Hindu traditions, the display of Bhairav's strength symbolizing the superior powers of the tantric path. Here you can see Bhairav clutching Brahma's severed head. In his other hands, he holds a trident, a sword, and a 2-headed drum, which Shiva uses to drum the universe into creation and dissolution. Early tantric practitioners imitated Bhairav's appearance and behavior by carrying their own skull cups and dwelling in cremation grounds in order to emulate him and overcome obstacles to enlightenment such as disgust, fear, and attachment. Rulers worshipped him in order to strengthen their political positions, drawing on his immense power. Here, Bhairav appears naked, a wild shock of hair streaming from his head like fire. His arched eyebrows, bulbous eyes, and fangs reveal a controlled fury. A dog, one that feeds on decaying flesh, accompanies him. This stone carving was made for a temple commissioned by a member of the Chola court in southern India. It shows how fierce tantric deities were brought into the public and popular arena of temple worship during the medieval period. The rise of Tantra within Buddhism occurred in response to its rise within Hinduism, creatively adapting by incorporating tantric deities and altering them to suit Buddhist goals. These are two tantric Buddhist gods who have incorporated many of Bhairav's attributes. It reveals the fluidity between Hinduism and Buddhism, but also shows competition. The bronze figure here looks like Bhairav, but he's also actually trampling the Hindu god Bhairav under one of his feet. This part of the exhibition also explored Tantra's radical challenge to gender norms. Tantra presented a new worldview which saw all material reality as animated by Shakti, divine feminine power. This worldview inspired the dramatic rise of goddess worship in medieval India. Tantric goddesses challenged traditional models of womanhood as passive and docile in their intertwining of destructive and maternal power. The earliest known text to describe the idea of Shakti is the Devi Mahatmya, or Glory of the Goddess. This is a folio from a later edition. It tells the story of the goddess Durga, who defeats a series of demons embodying ignorance, who the gods had been unable to defeat. Durga's death blow became a popular subject in medieval temple sculpture. Here, an 8th century sculpture represents Durga as a weapon-wielding, lion-riding warrior who has defeated the buffalo demon Mahisha, who threaten the stability of the universe. She was adopted by many rulers as their guardian and regarded as a source of their strength. In the Devi Mahatmya, a group of tantric goddesses called the Matrikas, or mothers, helped Durga to defeat the demons. Their martial abilities were harnessed by rulers to ensure victories on their own battlefields. This is a temple sculpture of the sow-headed mother Varahi. She carries a skull cup containing wine or blood. This is a recurring tantric attribute. Here we see Chamunda, the leader of the mothers. She's skeletal to signal her constant hunger, which she satisfies by consuming demonic forces. She carries a sword of wisdom with which she destroys not only demons, but also obstacles to enlightenment. She dances on a corpse, which embodies the fragile human ego that must be overcome. Although she appears fierce, she also conveys compassion and a desire to assist followers on their spiritual path by releasing them from ignorance. In the exhibition, her symbolism was decoded. This was an interpretive strand that ran throughout the exhibition. In each section, we highlighted an object that demanded extra unpacking, and we decoded its symbolism using specially designed graphics. This also helped us with the challenges of the exhibition's word limit. Each object label could only be around 80 words maximum, and group labels for several different objects could be 120. So this was very challenging in the exhibition, as you can imagine, with such a complex subject matter. We worked closely with an interpretation officer to ensure that the language and tone was as accessible as possible. Luckily, the accompanying catalogue presented an opportunity to expand further on the subject and go into greater depth beyond the parameters of the exhibition. This 10th century Tantric goddess from Tamil Nadu represents a yogini. From a distance, her voluptuous nudity attracts the eye and invites the viewer to approach, but closer observation reveals the fearsome details of her fangs, angrily arched eyebrows, and earrings made from a dismembered hand and a cobra. Yoginis are described in some of the earliest tantric texts. Seductive yet dangerous, these goddesses could transform into women, birds, tigers, or jackals as the mood took them. Two of her forearms here are decorated with cobra armlets, and she holds a skull cup for alcohol or blood and a skull-topped staff. Her wild hair fans out behind her in fiery waves. This sculpture is part of a group that would have once been enshrined in a temple dedicated to the yoginis. Between the 10th and 13th centuries, royal patrons commissioned yogini temples across India. Rulers believed that yoginis could predict the future, protect their kingdoms against disease or enemy armies, and help them win new territories. This space in the exhibition evoked an imaginative and immersive recreation of one of the most famous yogini temples in India, which is located in Hiraphone in Odisha and was built around the 10th century. We wanted to transport visitors to a time when devotion to these goddesses was at its height. Here is the original temple in Hiraphone. Most yogini temples were circular and unique in their roofless design, perhaps in order to attract yoginis from the sky into the sacred courtyard. In the exhibition, we showed 12 of the 64 yoginis which encircle the temple's interior walls. Here are details of some of the yoginis at Hiraphone. Some stand and dance upon animals that they can shapeshift into. Others balance upon corpses and dismembered heads, and some drink from skull cups. For the imaginative evocation of the temple, we took inspiration from medieval Sanskrit texts which describe the kinds of tantric rituals that may have been carried out within these spaces, including the consumption and offering of wine, blood, and flesh, which were believed to energize the yoginis. These specialist rituals were considered most effective when carried out at night. The temple would have also invited devotional worship from visitors during the day. So we wanted to play with that idea of private and public forms of devotion by evoking the temple in nocturnal and daytime settings. So the light actually changed within the space within a 3-minute period. So you could have a sort of experience of the temple during nocturnal and daytime periods within quite a short amount of time. Since the yoginis are central to an understanding of Tantra and its relationship with divine feminine power, and they have a special place within Tantric practice, we wanted them to be a focus in the exhibition. Tantra's affirmation of the divine feminine was radical for its time, but how did this inform the lives of real women? One of the recurring themes of the exhibition explored how Tantra's emphasis on feminine power not only informed the rise of goddess worship in India, but also how this in turn affected the status of women. Earlier Hindu and Buddhist traditions taught that the female body was an impediment to achieving enlightenment, and that women should remain submissive and dependent upon men. Tantra, on the other hand, taught that women could achieve rapid enlightenment because they were natural embodiments of Shakti. Many tantric texts even say that for this reason, women should be venerated as goddesses in their own right. The ultimate aim of tantric practice is to become a deity, to fully internalize their power. Tantric images re-envisioned women as independent practitioners who were capable of achieving self-deification. We see this through the historical figure of Karaikal Amaya, who lived in Tamil Nadu in South India in the 6th century. According to popular accounts of her life, she was a very beautiful, very dutiful wife, but she was harboring a desire to pursue her own radical spiritual quest. She eventually abandoned her role as an obedient wife to become a follower of the god Shiva. She asked Shiva to replace her beauty with a fearsome appearance which echoed Chamunda's. Here you can see that she has assumed that fierce appearance. She's skeletal and has bulbous eyes and fangs. This is a modern representation of her that we have in the collection. For the exhibition, we were lucky enough to include a medieval sculpture of her from the Metropolitan Museum in New York. She's shown reciting one of her visionary poems, accompanying herself with a pair of cymbals. In one of her poems, she describes her time spent meditating in a cremation ground. This is Chamunda's favorite haunt, where she confronts and conquers her own ego and fear of mortality. Here is a quote from the poem. In the cremation ground where you hear crackling noises and the white pearls fall out of the tall bamboo, the ghouls with frizzy hair and drooping bodies, shouting with wide open mouths, come together and feast on the corpses. In rejecting her social role and assuming a transgressive tantric one, she achieved an enlightened state. Today, she's regarded as both a devotional and tantric icon and is venerated as a saint across Tamil Nadu. The allure of Tantra retained a hold over those in positions of power between the 16th and 19th centuries. One form of tantric practice that became particularly popular was Hatha yoga, or the yoga of force. Where earlier forms of yoga focused on concentration and mindfulness to escape the body, Hatha yoga harnessed the body itself as a sacred instrument to channel and master cosmic energy. The main competing powers at this time were the Hindu Rajput rulers of the northwest, the Islamic rulers of independent sultanates to the south, and the Mughal rulers of an empire that came to dominate India by the late 17th century. Members of these courts commissioned works representing the practice of Hatha yoga, as well as the lives of men and women who practiced it. This Mughal painting depicts a yogi in the guise of Bhairav having a vision of a Tantric goddess in a cremation ground. Yogis used complex postures and muscular contractions to direct the flow of breath. Techniques included visualizing the goddess Kundalini, an individual source of Shakti, as a serpent at the base of the spine. Around her is a network of energy centers known as chakras, each of which contains a deity. Together they make up the yogic body. Through breath control, Kundalini rises like a current, infusing the chakras with power. Awakening Kundalini became the practitioner's ultimate goal. This cosmic vision of the body is what is being visualized in this painting from the Welcome collection. This is very much about transformation in the world via the body, rather than transcendence of the world. The next section of the exhibition explored the spread of Tantric Buddhism across Asia via pilgrimage networks. Also known as Vajrayana, or the Path of the Thunderbolt, It flourished in Eastern India. Buddhist monasteries studied and taught the Tantras and attracted pilgrims from across Asia. This led to the rapid transmission of Vajrayana teachings. Tibet saw the founding of major monasteries, which became the new political players and often rivaled one another. Instrumental in the transmission of tantric teachings from India to the Himalayas were the Mahasiddhas, or great accomplished ones. Their life stories are filled with miraculous events, and they became hugely popular in Tibet. They wear human bone ornaments in imitation of tantric deities. This painting depicts the Mahasiddha Saraha in the center. He composed songs about the body as a channel to enlightenment. This is part of a series of paintings of Mahasiddhas made for a Tibetan monastery, and we discovered that on the reverse of each one is the outline of a stupa, a Buddhist shrine, and a symbol of the enlightened mind of a Buddha. 3 Tibetan syllables for body, speech, and mind are written along the center, a mantra designed to consecrate the painting and to make it a suitable receptacle for the divine. The inscriptions along the base of the stupa include auspicious verses for the welfare of all beings. A pair of handprints is visible on either side, as you can see. They must have belonged to a senior lama who blessed and sanctified the tanka after its completion. Jalandhara is revered as a Mahasiddha in Tibet. In both Buddhist and Hindu contexts, he's regarded as a master of Tantric yoga. This important bronze of him performing Tantric yoga was a loan from the Rubin Museum in New York. He's balancing on a personification of his own ego, which he has transcended. One of the themes that the exhibition explored was the role of sex and divine union in Tantra in order to confront some of the more prevalent stereotypes. In Tantric texts, gendered symbolism is often used to articulate the 2 qualities to be cultivated on the path towards enlightenment: wisdom and compassion. These are visualized as a goddess representing wisdom and a god representing compassion in sexual union, as we see with this Tibetan bronze, in which the goddess swings one leg over the god's thigh in a passionate embrace. The goal is to internalize their qualities by visualizing the deities uniting within the body through meditation. This Tibetan tanka shows 2 deities embracing. Their red-rimmed, wild eyes and laughing, fanged mouths suggest their immense power. They are deities to be adored as well as emulated. The image evokes the interplay of feminine wisdom and masculine compassion within the practitioner's body. Both deities hold up weapons with which they destroy misplaced pride, attachment, anger, ignorance, and worldly desire. The Tantric text here describes the benefits of ritually engaging in sexual rites in order to transcend desire itself, healing an internal obstacle by strategically embracing and affirming it. The line, "By passion the world is bound, by passion too it is released," is inscribed on this folio. Even a celibate monk or nun could engage with this concept through visualizing deities in union. You'll notice that the deities here are both wearing crowns of human skulls, and he's carrying a skull cup in one of his many hands. The representation as well as the use of human remains in tantric practice is a reminder of the impermanence of the body and the importance of overcoming attachment to the idea of a fixed self. Now, as you'll all know, in Tibet, practitioners often left their skulls and other bones after their death to a lama and to monasteries in order to gain spiritual merits in the next life. So this part of the exhibition that you can see was developed in consultation with members of the Tibetan community and scholars of Tibetan Buddhism. During workshops, we discussed the role, the history and the care of ritual objects made with human remains. This is obviously a sensitive subject that many of our visitors won't have been familiar with. In the show, we included the voices and perspectives of members of the Tibetan community who took part in the workshop via audio stops. Visitors could hear contributors discuss their personal perspectives on the use of human remains in Tantric Buddhism and what these objects meant to them. This example of a skull cup ornamented with a metal base and cover may have been used for an inner offering rite, during which the practitioner visualizes the skull as his or her own severed head, into which they pour their internal poison obstacles, such as self-grasping. The practitioner then imagines the contents brought to boiling point and transformed into a nectar of enlightenment. As part of the ritual, they drink the consecrated liquid from the skull cup, often in the form of alcohol or tea. The ritual serves to jolt the practitioner and unlock him or her from attachment to a fixed sense of self and its resulting cravings. This Tibetan painting from the Rubin Museum represents the renowned female tantric master Machi Gladrum, who lived in the 11th century. She introduced new tantric practices designed to overcome the fear of death and attachment to self, and initiated hundreds of disciples. And as many of you will know, she's most famous for popularizing the practice known as chö, meaning to cut, which involved the use of human remains as instruments, like the one shown here. It entailed the visualization of the dissection of one's own body, and by extension the ego, which is presented as an offering to divine spirits. She advised carrying out chö at night in a frightening place, such as a charnel ground, in order to directly confront the limitations of one's fear and to conquer it. The goal of the practice is to sever and dismember all ties to the idea of a fixed self. The sounds of a two-headed skull drum and a trumpet made from a human thigh bone invite the spirits to devour the body during this ritual. In the accompanying audio stop, visitors could listen to Lama Rinzin, a respected Tibetan monk from the Kagyu tradition based in Sheffield, as he performed an abbreviated version of the chö ritual using a thigh bone trumpet and a drum. The role of human remains in Tantra is still very much misunderstood in the West. This goes back to the 19th century during the colonial period, when British officials encountered these instruments and associated them with black magic. This leads us to the penultimate part of the exhibition, which explored the role of Tantra during British rule in India and how Tantric goddesses were harnessed for their insurgent potential during the fight for Indian independence. This part of the show was explored for material that I was particularly familiar with because my PhD focused on this topic. The exhibition itself presented a critical approach to empire that emphasized South Asian voices and agency and de-centered Eurocentric narratives. It was also important to highlight the fact that colonial misunderstandings of Tantra went on to inform stereotypes of it as a cult connected to sex and black magic. Throughout history, the Tantric goddess Kali has been both a protective mother and a revolutionary icon for her devotees. This figure dates to the late 19th century and was made in Bengal, which was an early center of Tantra. Clay sculptures of the goddess like this are made every year for the Kali festival, which takes place in the autumn and is one of the biggest festivals in Bengal. They're housed in temporary shrines, which are set up on street corners, and devotees visit each one, providing the goddess with offerings. It's believed that images of Kali become enlivened when ritually venerated in this way. As you can see here, a garland of severed heads hangs from her neck, corpses from her ears, and hands from her girdle. In her upper left hand, she would have carried a sword, which is now lost. The lower left hand carries a severed head. Her mouth is smeared with blood, and she sticks out her tongue as though thirsting for more. Tantric texts describe her as having a gaping mouth with which she devours negative and demonic forces. Although she appears fierce, she's approached as a mother figure. The severed heads represent the human ego, which Kali helps devotees to transcend. Her top right hand displays a gesture of fearlessness to reassure and protect devotees. She's shown standing on her husband, the god Shiva. According to Tantric belief, existence itself results from the erotic union between Shakti as creative force, embodied here by Kali, and Shiva as pure consciousness. The symbolism of Kali striding over Shiva reflects her superiority, as without her he would remain inert and the universe would perish. Without Shakti, Shiva is literally a shava or corpse, emphasized here by his deathly pallor. Ramprasad Sen was a tantric mystic who presented Kali as a ruthless yet compassionate mother. Here he sings about Kali, followed by the goddess herself. She carries the sword of wisdom, which symbolizes the destruction of the ego. Ramprasad's poetry describes his relationship with Kali as that of lover and beloved. As he says in one of his poems, and to quote that poem, "She's playing in my heart. All I ask, my crazy mother, is that you stay put." End quote. His verse resonated at a time of crisis in Bengal. The British East India Company raised land taxes even as crops in the region failed, transferring the wealth to Britain. This led to the Bengal famine of 1770 and to the deaths of over 1 million people. Kali became an icon of strength, promoted through poetry and public festivals. Kali's popularity became a focus for revolutionary politics during the late 19th century. At the time, Bengal was not only a tantric centre, but also the nucleus of British rule. Kali gripped the British psyche as an icon of horror and irrationality. Colonial officials completely misunderstood her symbolism and assumed she was demonic. In one of the first studies of Hinduism for the West, the company soldier Edward Moore included this image on the left of the goddess and emphasized her demonic qualities. The text accompanying this image of Kali asks the reader to, quote, "Picture to himself this goddess of horrid form, of gigantic proportions, smeared with blood, and imagine what a hold such a religion must have on the sensibilities of its followers." End quote. Colonial anxieties around Kali would escalate with the rise of anti-colonial movements in Bengal. In 1917, a report was published detailing the terrorist activities of Bengali revolutionaries and their allegiance to Kali. This is its frontispiece. We borrowed the original report from the British Library. The author, who was the Director of Criminal Intelligence, was disturbed by rumours surrounding their secret cult-like rituals believed to involve the consecration of bombs to the goddess. Indian revolutionaries in Bengal effectively exploited British fears and misconceptions of the goddess as a bloodthirsty demon mother and harnessed her as an anti-colonial symbol. We can see this through this particular print, produced around 1895 by a studio in Calcutta, the capital of Bengal. This example continued to circulate after 1905, when Bengal was partitioned by the British to weaken the growing independence movement. Kali's sacrificial heads here assumed an alternative meaning. A colonial administrator anxiously described this image as featuring what appeared to be British-looking heads, a prediction of the fall of the British Empire, which led to its censorship. Perhaps he was right to be concerned. By this time, Kali was regarded by many as a symbol of Mother India rising up against her colonizers. In 1905, a writer for a seditious Bengali newspaper proclaimed, "Rise up, O sons of India. The foreign empire draws to an end, for behold, Kali rises in the east." I think it's this synthesis of modern politics and religious myth that make these images of Kali really fascinating. Aside from Kali, one of the most powerful icons employed by revolutionaries was the Tantric Goddess Cinemastar. Here she clutches her own severed head, which drinks one of the 3 streams of blood spurting from her neck. The other 2 streams nourish her attendants. She stands upon the deities of love and desire, as if to suggest she transcends desire while also being fundamentally supported by it. The image communicates the inseparability and interdependence of sex, life, and death. A Bengali text described Cinemastar as a symbol of the motherland, decapitated by the British, but preserving her vitality by drinking her own blood, representing an ideal of heroic fearlessness and self-sacrifice. In the final part of the exhibition, we explored how Tantra has been reimagined from the 20th century until today. Following the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947, artists sought to forge modern national styles influenced by the art of the past to assert a new aesthetic identity. Many were inspired by the philosophical and countercultural elements of Tantra. Artists associated with the Neo-Tantra movement in the 1970s adopted tantric symbols and adapted them to speak to the visual language of global modernism, particularly abstract expressionism. In this painting by Santosh, who was born in Kashmir, limbs emerge from an oval, egg-like shape to suggest a genderless figure seated in a cross-legged yoga pose known as the lotus posture. The head is replaced by an orange trident, the emblem of Shiva. This painting by Bangladeshi artist Biren Dey reflects the influence of the concentric shapes of mandalas, which frame luminous central deities. This center point is also understood as an expression of cosmic creation. Dey used color to suggest light and energy flowing from the center of his own paintings. In Britain and the States, Tantra had an important impact on the period's radical politics, where it was interpreted as a movement that could inspire anti-capitalist, ecological, and free love ideals. In the West, Tantra was reimagined as a cult of ecstasy that could challenge stifled attitudes to sexuality. Here we can see a pair of London-based designers drew on tantric images of deities in union to communicate this idea. This sort of psychedelic poster was actually, this type of poster was plastered all around London at the time. And this was a pull-out poster for the Oz magazine, which was a radical 60s magazine at the time. This poster advertises the Human Being Festival held in San Francisco, which heralded the Summer of Love of 1967. Yoga and meditation were promoted as transformative practices that could inspire minds to challenge the status quo. The poster includes a portrait of a yogi taken in Nepal. Yogis captured the popular imagination in the West as countercultural role models, famously yogis like Maharishi Mahesh and Osho. The impact of Tantra on musicians was also explored in this section. Mick Jagger had this logo designed for the Rolling Stones, inspired by Kali. It focuses on her protruding tongue, an attribute of the goddess originally suggesting her ravenous appetite on the battlefield. Here it was chosen to convey the band's rebellious anti-establishment spirit and allude to Jagger's voluptuous mouth. This was first reproduced on the inner sleeve of their Sticky Fingers album in 1971. From the 1960s, American jazz music drew on global sources. The decolonization of territories across Africa and Asia, along with the rise of the Black Power movement, fostered new forms of Black spirituality. The jazz trumpeter Don Cherry was inspired by Tantric traditions and studied under the Indian musician and mystic Pran Nath. Here he's presented as a yogi with a Buddhist deity above him. This record of his from 1977 includes chanted mantras, which are tantric power words that embody the nature of a deity. He presents himself here as a yogi in the lotus posture. In the exhibition, we played one of his tracks called Mahakali, or Great Kali, which begins with Tibetan bells and continues with a trumpet sitar dialogue before erupting into a hailstorm of electric guitar chords and drum beats, as if to signal the goddess Kali's dramatic arrival. Today, Tantra is as alive as ever. Sects in India, including the Aghoris, reveal its enduring power. These images are from an archive of photographs of yogis associated with different sects in India and Nepal, taken by the Dutch photographer Dolf Hartziker. He conducted interviews with the men and women that he photographed as part of his fieldwork. So every photo was contextualized with information about the person and their background in the exhibition in order to avoid an ethnographic display approach. The practices of the Aghoris include smearing their bodies with the ash of burnt corpses from funerary pyres, as seen here, which is traditionally deemed polluting. For the Aghoris, transgressive practices are an expression of the tantric assertion that all is sacred, and there is no distinction between what is conventionally perceived as pure and impure, just as there is no distinction between the self and the divine. By shattering society's cultural conditioning of the mind, the Aghoris transcend ego-led emotions, such as fear and aversion, and instead nurture a non-discriminating attitude that affirms the power of the taboo. This photo shows an Aghori drinking out of a skull cup. He belongs to an ashram dedicated to treating leprosy. From the 1960s, the Aghoris began to turn their ashrams into social service centres dedicated to helping those stigmatized by society, whether through caste, disease, or disability. In this section, we also included a short film featuring a performance by Parvati Baal. She's a member of the Baal sect, who are wandering bards with close ties to Tantra, mainly based in Bengal and Bangladesh. They're famous for their mystical songs performed with stringed instruments, centering on the idea that divinity is present and accessible within the human body. Parvati Baal, a practitioner and teacher, was drawn towards the Baal way of life at the age of 16. As she says in an interview, Baal freedom is limitless. It gives one such a sense of peace and goes beyond religion, caste, creed, and any limited identities. Parvati gave a special live virtual performance as part of the exhibition's public program, which you can watch on the museum's events channel on YouTube. Tantra has gone on to influence modern feminist thought and artistic practice. Contemporary female artists have been inspired by tantric iconography and have also playfully subverted it. Although many, if not most, tantric traditions emphasize the role of women and goddesses, their traditional representations have sometimes been described as male constructions of femaleness. Certainly, they're often ambivalent characteristics, veering between overt eroticism and destructive violence, can be read as reflecting a male fear of feminine power. Nevertheless, this same ambivalence, which challenged traditional models of womanhood, has been a source of empowerment for modern women who continue to reclaim their spiritual authority in creative and emancipatory ways. The exhibition ended with dramatic works of art which harness tantric goddesses through the bodies of real women, evoking them in a feminist guise, including this one. The title of this almost 3-meter tall mixed media painting, Housewives with Steak Knives, challenges the stereotype of the submissive wife confined to the kitchen. It's by the Bengal-born British artist Shrutapa Biswas. Here, the housewife as Kali wears a garland of heads that the artist describes as figureheads of authoritarian patriarchy. Like Biswas, Bharti Kaur, born in London and now based in Delhi, draws on the bodies of real women in her creation of a series of life-size urban goddesses. This figure blurs the boundaries between mortal and divine. It presents the self-decapitated goddess Cinemastar with copper wires spurting from her neck like jets of blood. She holds a teacup, a witty allusion to British civility, which has become a substitute for a tantric skull cup about to be filled with blood. In her left hand, Cinemastar holds a cast of the skull of Lucy, the oldest known human ancestor. This nod to human origins alludes to Cinemastar herself as an embodiment of the foundation and cycle of life. She's ambiguously depicted as either penetrating or being penetrated, unifying both the feminine creative force and masculine consciousness that animates the universe. Kaur describes the goddesses that she is attracted to as androgynous and, as she puts it, strangely masculine. The exhibition aimed to offer new insights into a philosophy that has shaped lives and captured imaginations for more than a millennium. From its beginnings to the present day, Tantra has challenged not only gender norms, but also religious, cultural, and political establishments. The show charted Tantra's enduring potential for opening up new ways of seeing and changing the world. It's hoped that the case studies in the exhibition will have enabled the visitor to recognize certain symbols and iconographic patterns as central to the tantric imaginary, allowing them to read the philosophy through its imagery. Above all, we hope visitors will have been stimulated and challenged to question their own ideas about the nature of the divine. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing. The only thing I would say finally is, which I would have liked to have included in the presentation actually in the form of images, is that I was very, very lucky and privileged to work with Dashakama Aura on the public program, and which led to an absolutely fantastic collaboration with him and the Center of Bhutan Studies to create a film about the dissolution of Asan Mandala dedicated to Vajrayogini. And it was the most wonderful film, and it was which everyone can view on the British Museum Events channel still. It's been incredibly popular and beautifully put together, bringing together monks and nuns from across Bhutan. And it also led to the most amazing acquisition of a tanka 6 feet high by Dashakama Aura himself, inspired by this film collaboration, which just arrived in the museum recently, and we're really excited to display it in our South Asia gallery soon, which represents Vajrayogini and So it's just been an absolute pleasure to work with him and the center, and it's just great to have this material. It's like the legacy of the exhibition, producing more material relating to Tantra, new acquisitions, new possibilities, new relationships. So the exhibition led to a really exciting collaboration with the Center of Bhutan Studies, for which I'm really grateful.
Thank you, Dr. Ramos. In 1 hour, you have taken us through your visual evidence for a ride from how Tantric tradition or Tantrism was originated in India and how Buddhists incorporated some of the Tantric practices, and then how this tradition spread to other Asian countries and to Himalayan region through Mahasiddhas, and then to, invoking Goddess Kali to go against the colonial rule by academicians and then the reformers and all those scholars, and then to West even, how even jazz musicians are influenced by Tantric goddesses. Wonderful, Dr. Ramos. In 1 hour, you have taken us for such a ride. And then you have also demystified some of the mystery of Tantrism, like, term as erotic, demonic, something like that. And then you have mentioned in your presentation that actually all those things, whether it is the symbolic relationship between Shiva and Shakti or any other thing, the final ultimate goal was to overcome the negative or poisonous elements of the desire and the anger and the ignorance, etc. This was very wonderful. Thank you very much. I think that's what what we want to achieve. And you have also mentioned, I'm very happy towards the end of your presentation, that kind of a new wave, I hope, new world order based on Tantric tradition will happen, and that will be good for us. I mean, based on the principles, I'm talking about philosophical doctrines, which are similar to, anyway, the other sects of Buddhism. So thank you very much, Dr. Ramos, once again. And you have also mentioned that you are, you would like to continue your relationship with the Center for Bhutan and GNH studies. And I hope it will go, grow from strong to stronger, become stronger. And although I'd like to, I'll refrain from asking questions myself, but I would request our distinguished participants here, including Dr. Karma, if you have any question or any views, any comments, please, the floor is open for distinguished participants. Yes, there's a question from Dr. Tashwinsa. I have to read a question from one Tashwinsa. Please explain more on the relevance and significance of Tantra in today's world. Can I repeat? Please explain more on the relevance and the significance of Tantra in today's world. Yes, Dr.
I think there's so much relevance and significance today. I mean, I touched on that in the presentation, of course, but I think some of the recurring themes that come out strongest in a contemporary context are female empowerment, the role of women, how Tantra can empower women. Also, the theme of social inclusivity, which is very strong in Tantra. Something that I suppose I didn't really have a chance to talk about in the presentation is how Tantric initiation was open to people from different social backgrounds historically, including women and those marginalized by society. So that was actually one of the ways that Tantra gained popularity and challenged the hierarchical social order or the caste system within Orthodox Hinduism by breaking down distinctions. So I think that is still extremely relevant today, that theme of social inclusivity. We see that with you know, the Agori community as well in a very sort of tangible way, and the setting up of these centres, which are sort of social health, education reform centres. I think also in terms of the environment and the environmental movement, and the idea that all material reality is sacred has a lot of relevance for that, for today's environmental movement. Tantra can teach us a lot about how we need to revere the earth, and it had a big influence on a lot of environmental campaigners during the 60s, actually, when the environmental movement began. So that was something that actually was included in the exhibition, was a psychedelic poster influenced by tantric ideas on the earth as sacred, inspiring a psychedelic Save Earth Now poster. So that's still very relevant today. And the theme of religious pluralism as well, I think, is very strong and contemporary, because and I say this, for example, in the context of relationships between Islam and Hinduism. Today, obviously, there are many tensions. And I think Tantra teaches that there are really sort of interesting pluralistic relationships that develop. It's something that was explored in the exhibition, but I wasn't able to go into any depth in this presentation, was that there was a particular tantric community, the Naths, or the Nath yogis, a community formed around the 12th century, and they developed a really close relationship with Sufi mystics, and so there are really interesting variations of Sufi forms of yoga that are influenced by Tantra, and many exchanges between Sufis and Tantric yogis throughout the medieval period. And so I think we can learn so these are some of the very strong contemporary themes that come out, I think, and Tantra has still has so much to teach us around those themes.
Yes, I agree with you, Dr. Ramos. Like through Tantric tradition, we recognize women as wisdom, symbol of wisdom, Shakti, blah, blah, blah. And now we have 23 Nangarata. Please, you have the floor.
Yes. Thank you. Good afternoon to Dr. Ram. Good afternoon to Dr. Ramos and all the distinguished participants from London, and good evening to all the participants from Bhutan. It was such an enlightening presentation from Dr. Ramos, and just wanted to request for a copy of the slides. We could, if you can have a copy of the slides, we could. For me personally, I could read through it and build on the presentation done today. So I would like to request for a copy of the slides. Thank you.
I think I'm not sure who I'm going to. So I know that the meeting is being recorded, and then they'll be able to share it as a link. So you'll definitely have a copy of the presentation as a link. So I'm sure that can be arranged for sure.
I hope Dr. Ramos, you will. Some of the other arrange copy for him. Now we have a question again through mail. This is Purva Wangchu. Can you explain the origin of Tantric Mantra and its power or usefulness for spiritual growth, psychic ability?
That's a great question. I mean, mantras are really, really important, obviously, within tantric tradition, and the power of the word, it predates tantra. So in the Vedas, the power of the word and recitation is incredibly important to Vedic Hinduism, for example, which obviously predates tantric traditions. But what I suppose differentiates tantric mantras are the idea of internalizing the power of the deity through mantra, and that idea of achieving a sort of form of self-deification through mantra recitation. I wouldn't consider myself an expert on this subject because I'm much more of an art historian. So I'm sure someone could provide a much better explanation on the sort of history of mantras before and after Tantra. But I would say that, mantras, the importance of and the role of mantras dates to the time that Tantra begins as a philosophy, which we believe, there's some debate around that, but we believe that originates from around the 6th century onwards. And of course, Tantra itself as a philosophy is rooted in the texts, in Tantric texts, and where you find, mantras. And mantras are fundamentally power words, which you find not only in the texts, but also often, inscribed on objects and the visual arts. So I'm just trying to remember the phrasing of the question. I'm not sure I can really say any more than that because I'm definitely not an expert on mantras. But I think it's a really good question. I think that's probably all I can really say. But that's what differentiates tantric mantras, as far as I'm aware, really, is that notion of self-deification, internalizing the deity associated with the mantra that you're reciting.
Thank you again. There's one more question again. You again saying you have mentioned you have mentioned a little on the Hatha yoga, and how is Hatha yoga different from Tantra? Because Hatha yoga is different to Buddhist also. Maybe this is one reason why question. Please go ahead.
Yes, great question. There's actually been a really fantastic major research project at SOAS on Hatha yoga, led by Dr. James Mallinson. It's been a 5-year project looking at Hatha yoga, the history of it, and they discovered that the earliest text that talks about Hatha yoga is a Buddhist text. So, which really challenged a lot of views that Hatha yoga was a Hindu tradition. But anyway, I talked a little bit about Hatha yoga in the presentation, but Hatha yoga is essentially Tantric yoga. And it was popularized and was mainly associated with the Tantric Nat order, which was a particular sect that I think I mentioned arose around the 12th century. But essentially, Tantric yoga or Hatha yoga is all about perceiving the body as a channel to enlightenment. So this is what made it particularly tantric. It wasn't about transcendence of the body. It was about transformation of the body in this world. So the techniques that I mentioned about visualizing a goddess within the body, that goddess being Kundalini, or in the the Tibetan Buddhist context, Chandali, whether it's seeing that goddess as a snake, Kundalini, or Chandali as a kind of fire within the body. That, viewing that goddess as the individual source of power, and then around her, having a network of channels and energy centers. All of that is specifically tantric in nature. And also the introduction of physical yoga was particular to Hatha yoga as well. And essentially it's a completely different way of viewing the body and relating to the body, which is much more about actually using the body as a spiritual instrument. It's not about escaping the body, which was much more common to earlier forms of yoga, because earlier forms of yoga focused on forms of concentration and forms of mindfulness in order to essentially escape the body. The body was seen as something that was impure, essentially. So this is so Hatha yoga is tantric yoga, to answer the question.
Thank you, Ramos, Dr. Ramos. Now, let me ask you one question, because this is, I was reading your book, and then I came across that Sufis adopted or incorporated or learned, I don't know, or that the yoga, tantric yogas, so much so that Sufis and yogas identities have become blurred. That's what you said. Can you, that was the news for me. I didn't really know about Sufis, kind of learning tantric yogas and then practicing them as part of their own tradition, religious tradition. Could you please elaborate a little bit? Thank you very much.
Yeah, definitely. I find that also particularly fascinating. And there are so many interesting Mughal paintings that represent interactions between Sufi mystics and tantric yogis, which I found really, really interesting. Essentially, Sufism or Islamic mysticism really taught the idea of union with the divine in a very direct way. And that was quite, that resonated. There were resonances between that idea within Sufism and then the idea within Tantra of achieving unification with a deity. So there was already common ground there. And also the idea of overcoming the ego and achieving that union with the divine. Ideas around overcoming ego, there were also resonances there. Also, the power of mantra as well inspired many Sufi mystics. So they would take verses, words from the Quran, and use them, adopt them for forms of mantra recitation too. And then, as you say as well, Tantric yoga had a big impact on many Sufi mystics, and you see a lot of Sufi texts that describe Islamic forms of yoga, and also new ways of visualizing the channels and chakras within the body. So they don't adopt it in an identical way, the system of chakras. They actually adapt the idea. So they have their own ideas of how each chakra is inhabited by particular angels, for example, representing different the heart chakra might represent a particular sentiment, for example. So they adapted the yogic body system for their own purposes and in an Islamic context. So absolutely fascinating. but also again the idea of seeing the body in that sort of affirmative, the idea of affirming the body as a vehicle through which you can achieve unity with the divine. There were a lot of resonances there. So yes, that again, a very interesting example of how Tantra could be so pluralistic in a way, and these sort of blurring lines between Sufi and Tantric mystics, and how you see that in paintings too. Sometimes you're just not sure whether you're seeing a painting of a Sufi mystic or a Tantric yogi. Very, very interesting. Oh, you're on mute.
Right. And there's one question for Abhishek Tripathi. Please go ahead. Abhishek Tripathi.
Thank you, Dr. Dasho. Thank you, Dr. Imma. I think you actually put the whole history and how it is evolved, and I think that's your area of work as well. My question is on in the era of summer of '69, when it all started, let's say 67 or early 60s and all, and actually as a historian yourself, what you have to say that how it has impacted the society and general society at large about the Tantra in South Asia, and how it has impacted the study of Tantra itself in UK or elsewhere. Because that's where I think the whole perception, the whole idea of this Tantra has changed from there onwards because of the technology, and it was branded, as you suggested, with so many bands and all, and it draws a lot of young people there. So how do you, if you have to say something on that, it would be very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I suppose as well, it's useful for me to say a little bit about the origins of some of those stereotypes. I mean, I did touch on that in the presentation, but the origins of some of those stereotypes in the West in the first place. When the earliest translations of Tantric texts into English were carried out during the colonial period, the contents were totally misunderstood. And that is what went on to inform the misunderstandings of Tantra in the West, which still obviously exists today. And then also that was informed by misunderstandings of Tantric imagery itself. So images of Yabyum, of Kali, etc. They misinterpreted that material without recognizing the philosophical underpinnings, basically. And then, of course, by the 60s and the 70s, Tantra was then reimagined as a free love movement and a sort of cult of ecstasy that could challenge repressive attitudes to sexuality, reflecting a sort of liberal approach to sex. So it was almost like a complete U-turn. And I think today, actually, one person who had a huge impact on how Tantra was then conceived in the West was Ajit Mukherjee, who was based in Delhi, had a huge collection of Tantric objects, paintings, instruments, and he wrote books about Tantra, which had a big impact on the artists associated with the Neo-Tantra movement. But then the exhibition that I mentioned that happened at the Hayward Gallery in 1971, that was actually Ajit Mukherjee's collection. That whole exhibition consisted of his collection. They shipped it from Delhi to London. And it's interesting because Ajit Mukherjee's books, which were huge, had a huge impact in the West, their aim was to demystify Tantra as a sort of cult associated with black magic. And he was very, very invested in presenting Tantra as a philosophy. But the thing is that maybe the way it was curated, it sort of was much more looking to what the audience wanted in the West, which was sort of more along the lines of seeing it as a cult of ecstasy, because it was the early 70s at the time. So there's always been that tension between viewing Tantra as only a philosophy that doesn't necessarily engage in the taboo. So in a way, sort of deodorizing Tantra, versus the other extreme, which is to see Tantra as only associated with sex and black magic. I think that that's always been a tension in the West, even now today as well. That's a tension that exists within scholarship, is to either disavow the sort of taboo, the role of the taboo within Tantra, or to only focus on the taboo within Tantra. And actually, one key figure that I talk about in the book is Arthur Avalon, someone called Arthur Avalon, who was a judge in colonial Bengal, and he was fascinated by Tantra, and his aim, a little bit like Ajit Mukherjee much later, but so his aim was to demystify Tantra and present it as a philosophy, but he completely disavowed the role of the taboo, really, in a way, and sort of drew on many. He sort of relied on, in a way, he sort of diluted Tantra through his presentation of Tantra, but his books also had a big impact in the West. So I think there's been a whole process of that tension between these two extreme views of Tantra in the West.
Thank you, Dr. Ramos. Now it's 1.5 hours. This is the time given to us. And firstly, may I thank you very much once again, and also to have this kind of intellectually stimulating, enriching, enlightening discourse is because of the leadership of Dr. Karma Ura, the president of the Center for Bhutan and GNA Studies. We also thank you for your leadership and for organizing such seminar. And I know you have another seminar on 28th of this month on Tsangpajare and etc. I hope our friends will again participate in that seminar too. And I must admit here, I must declare that in fact, I'm very happy I was able to make it today because I was caught up in traffic jam. Can you imagine in Bhutan, there's a traffic jam, and there was a sort of a landslide, and I had to, and the pandemic was, come on, it's time. And then I had to run, practically I had to run and then catch up on taxi and come over here, and so that I didn't miss your wonderful, insightful, enlightening talk, Dr. Ramos. And I hope you will again next time share with your insight, wisdom, and etc. And thank you all other participants for joining us. And as I said, this is not possible because of the leadership of Dr. Karma Ura, and they have one more. I mean, they continue to have this seminar. They'll continue to have this kind of seminar. And then on next 28th July, they have seminar on Tsangpajare to Pakaju. I hope our friends will attend that seminar too. Dr. Ramos, it was nice, really, listening to your wonderful, insightful. You really made us, like such a difficult subject, make it so easy. Makes it so easy. Not Tantrism for me is so complex, I find it, but you made it so easy through your visual evidence and presentation. Once again, thank you, Dr. Ramos, and thank you all. Goodbye.